Thank you. It was great for the invitation. Great to be here. Speaking on the topic of authority, I was tempted to start by asking a show of hands who has ever had a bad run-in with authority, and I realized that would everyone who's had a bad experience with authority. That would be all of us. It's either parents, see me in the principal's office, those friendly red and white flashing lights behind your car. We've all had experiences with authority. But it is not just being on the receiving end. We're going to talk a little bit this evening about how all of us have authority. So we want to think about authority for several reasons, because we all have it, because we're all under it, as I mentioned. But we also need to think about some things related to that. Maybe we need to think about authority because we all abuse it. Maybe we'll think about that. Or maybe because we all reject it, or all have times in our lives when we wish we weren't under the authority that we are at that time under. In a minute, I will sort of go through our outline to get us situated for what we're going to be thinking about this evening. I'm basing this on a book that my employer, Crossway, printed called Authority by Jonathan Leeman. I actually have a few extra copies, so if you are really interested in this topic and want to read more, I can get you one in my handy box in the back. But we're going to talk first by just thinking about what is authority. We're going to use that really common Christian paradigm of thinking about authority as it was meant to be, authority as it was warped by sin and the fall of Adam and Eve, and then what it yet can still be as God is continuing to work through the authority that we have. Then we'll kind of switch gears and think about the other side of the coin, about submission. I mean, what is submission? Are there limits to submission? How do we know when perhaps we need not to submit? That's always everyone wants to get to right to those. Tell me the times I don't have to do what my parents tell me, right? Or I don't have to pay the tax on that or this. We'll talk about that. And then near the end of our time, we'll just run through some, I'll call them principles for exercising authority wisely. If we have authority, and I'm going to argue that we all do, how are we going to use it? How are we going to use it well? Actually, in the book, there's even more. The author goes into examples in lives, whether it be in the church or in the home or in the workplace with government. We're not going to have time to get into those, but it's a real interesting read. I encourage you to pick it up if you need some good reading. So, that being said, let's dive in with what is authority. What is authority? Authority comes into play when power is present. So if power is the ability or the capacity to do something, to do anything, then authority would be the moral right or license to make decisions with that power. It's to take the power one has, and if the person has authority, then he or she has the moral right to make decisions, to exercise that power. So for some of us, the only authority we have might be the own thoughts, the thoughts in our brain, or the mess in our bedroom. If you're a 3-year-old, you don't have much more authority than that. Some of us are given authority in other places, but we're all on a sliding scale. We all have authority, and that means if we're all on that sliding scale, there's always people on the higher side of that scale until you get to, say, God. Everyone has some or several authorities over them. For us to have authority, though, let's talk about formal authority. You're going to need some things for it to take place. You're going to need an authorizer. You're going to need someone to say, X has authority over Y. I cannot come up to a random person on the street and tell him or her what to do as a private citizen. I don't have that authority. No one has authorized me to exercise that authority. That leads to the second thing you need to have authority, and that are subjects. Someone over whom you're exercising your authority. And then thirdly, there must be, for it to be proper authority, there must be boundaries. I mentioned earlier the flashing red and blue lights in your rearview mirror. The police officer has the authority over how fast you're driving down the road. But he doesn't have the authority to tell you need to be driving a blue car instead of a red car. Okay, that's a silly example, but it gets to the fact that all authority has boundaries, has limits. You can already anticipate this will come in handy when we begin talking about submission and the limits of submission when the authority reaches or oversteps those boundaries. So as we think about authority as it is meant to be, my author, Dr. Lehman, goes about it by giving us a series of sort of counterbalancing factors. So authority, you could say it both stoops down low, and it also exercises transcendence. So good authority gets down into the weeds, gets down into the lives of the people over whom it has authority. It's not aloof, but yet it still has a transcendence. We all know the really good, say, high school basketball coach who the kids respect. They look up to him. They know just by the way he walks into the gym that he has authority. He has that sort of transcendent authority over them. But if he's not down in the trenches, if he's not stooping low, if he's not getting out there and helping his players, maybe he wants them to do a drill, so he shows them how to do it. Or maybe a teacher wants to help a student, so she literally stoops. She gets down on her knees next to the student's desk and helps him with his mathematics or whatever. You need both. You need the transcendence, but you also need the stooping, the nearness, the imminency. A good authority loves truth and justice, but also mercy and grace. A person with good authority will want the right things to be done. He or she will want things to be done in order, will want the rules to be followed because she understands why the rules are in place and what they are seeking to accomplish. But a good leader also loves mercy and grace. If you're going to be the sort of, your parent who's going to respond equally to each and every infraction that your child, makes, you're going to drive each other crazy. I mean, you're not going to get anything done. You have to know when to forgive. You have to know when to be gracious and when to be merciful. And you have to know when the most loving thing to do is to not to not let it slide. To say, for your good, this is the time when we really have to make sure we follow the rules, follow what is put before us. We love truth and justice. We love grace and mercy. This kind of gets to the next counterbalancing aspect of authority as it is meant to be. Authority restricts freedom for the purpose of promoting freedom. To give you a non-leadership example, think of a gardener with his roses. He restricts the freedom of the rose, where it can grow. He uses stakes and poles if he wants it to grow in a certain way. He might prune the bush. He might restrict the freedom of the plant for the greater purpose of the health and vitality and freedom of the plant to, as we might say, be the plant that it was always meant to be. I really mean that, to be what its creator meant it to be. So with children, with the government over its citizens, with a teacher in the classroom, with a religious or spiritual leader, you restrict the freedom. That is to say, you're not just, no rules, just everyone going around pell-mell, but it's for a purpose. It's so that person can develop into the free and mature person that he or she is meant to be. That leads really to the next. A good leader has to know that balance between allowing those people under her or him to make mistakes and knowing when to take the steering wheel and lead the group or the person in the right direction. And really, it's a process of, over time, hopefully, being able to take your hands off the wheel more and more. Or think of a golf instructor. Often literally with a young student, the golf instructor will stand behind the student and swing the club for her. Literally be the one doing the swinging of the club. But eventually, the instructor will take a step back. And then maybe he'll only, adjust the elbow or the stance. Or then he may just not do anything, with the person and just give tips or hints. And then maybe someday, the instructor won't even be giving lessons anymore. But, the person may call after a round, hey, can we talk about this or that? And eventually the goal is that they would become, peers. That maybe they would play around together and the instructor would get some tips from the student, et cetera, et cetera. But that's learning how the interplay works in real time between, you might say, giving the person leash and pulling back where necessary. Ultimately, then, good authority is life-giving. If I can quote a famous leader, King David, in his last words in Scripture, in 2 Samuel, he says, "When one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth." A good king, a good ruler, literally gives life. So that's all well and good. That's how leadership is to take place, what it is to emulate, what is it seeking to do. However, if I could quote another verse of Scripture in Ecclesiastes, "I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. In the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness." Authority fails when we make the same mistake that mankind has been making ever since the beginning. Either misusing the authority that we have, or taking authority that we never were given in the first place. In the Bible, we have Adam and Eve is given as the introduction of evil and sin into the world, trying to be like God, assuming that they knew everything, assuming that they were all powerful, assuming that they were perfect, assuming that they were able to do whatever they wanted. And so they both usurped the authority of the one who had placed them there, but they also sought to take authority that was never theirs to start with. And so good authority recognizes its limits. Bad authority, because it has no warrant, because it has no authorization, because it has no right, ultimately it has to be driven by fear, or by pride, or by desperation, often by violence. Because when proper authority breaks down, often the person thinks the only trick left in his arsenal is the club of physical violence. We'll speak later of how good leaders persuade, how good leaders exercise their authority. But when it breaks down, we see the photo negative, don't we, of those things: fear-driven, desperate, violence. This gets into the realm of abuse. There's been a lot of talk recently, especially in Christian circles, of spiritual abuse, which is, again, a misuse of authority. If abuse in general is taking one's authority and causing harm to another, then spiritual abuse would be causing harm to another and using God's name, using Scripture, using religion, using one's position of authority in a church or some sort of religious institution to do those things, to cause that harm. That's spiritual abuse. And it's something that I think is becoming more and more talked about, not perhaps because it's more and more prevalent, but because people are more and more sensitive to it and recognizing it for what it is. So if that's leadership or in authority as it is intended to be, and that's how things have broken down and gone wrong, we still have hope. That's not the end of the story. That spiritual abuse will not be the last thing we talk about this evening. Because there is a sort of authority that reaches out into a broken world. There's a sort of authority that accommodates itself for weak, for broken people. There's a sort of authority that's willing to suffer on behalf of its people. Now we're talking about the sort of authority that rescues and repairs and that's interested in second chances. And as I said before, that stoops down to the level of those who are underneath it. The sort of authority that redeems and sacrifices. Earlier I quoted King David, who was sort of a hit and miss leader, better in some realms than others. His son, Solomon, interestingly, one of the places in which David really seemed to fail was in the parental authority part of his life. But his son, Solomon, wrote one psalm. And in this psalm, he says that the king defends the cause of the poor of the people. May the king give deliverance to the children of the needy. May the king crush the oppressor. This is the authority that we need in this broken world. The sort of world that, as Dan was saying in the introduction, needs not a revolution, not upheaval, but restoration of what is there with the assistance of wise and mature and self-sacrificial authority. This is, I think, the kind of authority that we all want, isn't it? We don't even necessarily, we know we're not going to get perfect leaders, but we do want leaders who are willing to be in it with their people, with their children, with their flock, with their family members, whoever they are having authority over and leading, who aren't going to stand aloof, who aren't going to say, I'm going to give the diktats and you're going to obey, and that's the end of the story. The buzz phrase 20 years ago was servant leadership, and it's a good phrase. I mean, even Jesus said he came to be not the sort of leader that lords it over others, but the sort of leader who would serve. If you read the stories of Jesus in the Gospels, there's never any doubt who's in charge. I mean, there's never any doubt who was the center of attention, who was the one with the authority, who was the one who was teaching like no one else had ever heard, who was speaking and the wind and the waves stopped. But he served. I mean, he went to the places where other people didn't want to go, didn't think that they should go, didn't think that he should go. Talk to the people that were overlooked and marginalized and worse in that society. Because he realized his authority wasn't damaged by doing those things. It wasn't put into question or jeopardized. In fact, it was in brighter and sharper and more beautiful relief. So that's the sort of authority that we want to see. We want to exercise ourselves. We want to be under. We'll stop here for questions before I go on. Before we get into submission, I want to see if anyone has any questions about sort of authority in general so far. Yes, sir.
You seem to be talking more about a delegated authority. Sometimes we recognize other kinds of authority, like moral authority, authority of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Now those, I'm not sure they fit the definition of authority, and that they don't have necessarily the means for imposing anything.
That's correct.
How do those come into play?
Those would be, I think those would be sort of different definitions of a similar concept. You're right. I'm speaking particularly about someone who has been given license to exercise authority. But I do believe expertise gives one license. And that's actually often how the world works. The people who have authority often receive it implicitly before they ever get it explicitly. And I think there's something good there because for a couple reasons. One, because there's often a lot more buy-in because people recognize it themselves. They recognize this person hasn't sort of just dropped out of the sky to be over them, or has been appointed by someone a million miles away that no one knows or has any impact on the local place where this person is. A moral authority, similarly, is something that is gained over time. It's sort of like a 25-year-old pastor. He has official authority. He's been to school and he got his license, whatever. But his moral authority is very, very limited, and that's okay. But the 65-year-old guy who's maybe never been to seminary, he's a lay preacher. He's worked the trades his whole life, but has great moral authority for the reason that his life has shown, has demonstrated, has borne fruit. And so I think he needs to exercise his authority in the same general ways. I think he still can call that authority, and I think people do. So there's certainly more similarity than dissimilarity.
I've always wondered, when does a person with one kind of authority have a moral obligation to bow to another kind of authority? I'm thinking things like years ago with the shuttle explosion, where those with the delegated authority simply overruled the lower
Right.
level guys who had the expertise and were telling them those rings won't hold.
Right.
Okay. Did they have a moral obligation to actually bow to the authority of expertise?
Yes.
Yeah.
They were to exercise their authority properly over the experts. That's integral to what that authority looks like. It's sort of like, a lot of Christians believe that a husband, this is a controversial example, has authority over his wife. And when does he yield to her moral authority? 100% of the time, every single time. And that's what it means to love her well. And so the fact that someone has been given, he's the administrator of NASA, or whatever the formal authority was, yielding and listening to those under him was baked into the cake, or at least it should have been. Now we can talk a little about that more. I'm going to close with some principles for applying authority, and I think that may be germane to that. Other questions? Yes.
So if moral authority is authority too, what is the definition of all authority?
It's good question. What's the definition of all authority? Well, it's still what I would give to begin with, because I said it was the right or license to make decisions with whatever power one has. So if you have moral authority, you have, I would say, a moral right. And I would say you would have a moral license. And again, a license implies a licensor. So it may be the school in which this person with authority works, recognizes this co-worker as someone with that sort of authority, even if he doesn't have the right credentials that a different group would give. If we can, let's move on for now to talk about the other side of authority. The other side of authority being submission. It'd be good, of course, to begin by defining submission as well. And the definition in this book argues that submission is deferring by moral constraint to another person's judgments. Submission would be deferring by moral constraint to another person's judgment. We can, I think, over the course of my thoughts on this word, we'll see why each of those segments of that definition is important. This is going to entail several things. Notice it doesn't say that submission requires agreement. Even if we don't immediately agree with the judgments of the person of authority, we could still submit. Because, regardless, submission is always a choice. And choices that we take, choices that we do not take or make, always involve a moral judgment. So even if we don't agree with the judgment of the person over us, we are still exercising our moral judgment when we have chosen to submit. Choosing to submit, even if I wouldn't have chosen the same course of action. It's important here to recognize that this does not turn us into automata. This does not turn us into robots, because we are still choosing and acting on a prior choice to submit. Often, of course, we don't actively choose, I'm going to submit this time, I'm going to submit this time, because we're not taking it on a case-by-case basis most of the time. We're in a relationship. The child even gets to the point, hopefully, where she might sort of naturally submit because of trust for the parent, because of past consequences, both those imposed by the parent and those imposed by the laws of physics and etc., for not submitting to one's parents. Because over time, ideally, the act of submission makes us wiser. It enriches us. We begin to understand and to think like those in authority over us. We begin to understand why the authority directed us in a certain way or drove us away from a different course of action. Part of submission is honing our own judgment. It's beginning to appreciate the wisdom, if it is wise leadership. I'll talk about in a minute if it's not. But honing better judgment ourselves. This is deferring to another person's judgment. But I also said it's deferring by moral constraint to another person's judgment. Most of the time, physical constraints are totally out of the question. There would be exceptions, of course. If there were, I mentioned a law enforcement officer may have to physically restrain you if you're about to harm or somehow hurt someone else or to commit a crime or whatever. But even then, the constraint is ultimately moral because it's backed in the law. It's backed in that which society has decided is illegal or wrong to do. So we're not talking about ultimate physical constraints. And most of the time, we're not talking about physical constraints at all. You'd be hard-pressed, for instance, in schools these days to find any that would still use physical constraints. Most other institutions never did use them to start with. In the book, the author argues that these moral constraints come ultimately from God. That's probably true. It's not necessarily vital for understanding my definition. But I think what is vital for understanding my definition is that this, therefore, requires some level of trust, some level of, maybe even call it faith, of relying on the wisdom and the leadership, the authority of another. You'll be hard-pressed to find someone who is submitting in bad faith or in no faith at all. Often, it's not really submission at all in those situations. It may look like it from the outside, and I suppose that's better than nothing. But if a teenager is obeying his parents while cursing them under his breath, and sort of once they go away and undoing everything that he just did or what they tried to do, I think we would all agree, hey, that's probably not actually submission. That does actually require trust in the person giving the dicta, telling the person what to do. And again, we ideally grow in our judgment as we learn what it means to submit well. what it means to have good authority over us. So part of submission is deferring by moral constraint to the moral judgments of another. But there's a second part of the definition that this book adds that I think is helpful. That's actually what I was just getting at with the teenage son. And that's deploying your gifts or your resources or whatever you have for the sake of fulfilling that person's judgment. It's not enough to merely say, yeah, I mentally submit, or yeah, I think that's probably a good idea, or yeah, I would have made the same judgment. No, it actually involves the agency of following through, of, like I said, deploying those gifts that you have for the purpose of fulfilling that person's judgment. But I hope we've seen, as we've talked about, that this does not make it dehumanizing. Because like I said, it requires agency. This is not, I think, the place to argue free will or not. But it requires the engagement of somebody's will. It's not you're sort of reducible to grit your teeth and bear it. Because there's a pathway to growth there, as I mentioned. And ultimately, what I mentioned at the beginning with the sort of continuum of authority, submitting is part of being in authority. Part of being in authority is submitting to the person who is over you. If you're in a organizational flow chart, or perhaps a little less formal areas of life, there may not be someone with an office on the floor above you or a few extra letters after his or her name, but there's going to be someone who you report to, or someone to you feel, even if it's moral authority, bound to that person. There's that sort of submission in any part of authority. There's also submission, like I said, to the boundaries that set out your authority. A police officer learns pretty quick what he has the right to do, what he has no right to do. He learns pretty quick what is outside his bailiwick, to use an appropriate word in that context. He understands what he must submit to. He must submit to the law. He must submit to the rights of the citizenry. Lots of things that a person in authority must himself submit to. Without that, you have tyranny. And with tyranny, you don't have true authority at all, for the reasons that I think we've seen. So if that's submission, we need to think about what do we do when tyranny arises, or what do we do when we think tyranny arises. After all, I've mentioned the limits of authority, that authority is full of limits, so it would only follow that submission has limits too. And I don't think these are especially controversial. We'll talk about 3 limits, and then we'll talk about how to decide if these limits apply. The obvious one is we do not have to submit, or we should not submit, when doing so would require wrongdoing. Obviously, you kind of leave the barn door open a little bit with that word wrongdoing, because what kind of wrongdoing? I would say any kind of wrongdoing, which is kind of a cop-out answer too. But if it requires you to break your word, if it requires you to break the law, if it requires you to break, Christians would argue, God's law or God's word. If any of those things are true, if it requires you to commit wrongdoing, you must not submit. I think we can all think of examples even given in Holy Scripture of this, whether it would be midwives commanded to kill babies and they refuse, or young men commanded to bow down to an image of a pagan king, or apostles in the book of Acts commanded not to fulfill the command of Jesus to preach. We can think of examples when not submitting was the only course of action, because the authority was attempting to require wrongdoing. Related to this, even if the authority is not requiring wrongdoing, it is still appropriate to refuse to submit when the authority is outside its lane, outside its boundaries. We can think of times in history. Think in times of European history when, for instance, the Pope, not to pick on the Pope, but the Pope thought he had the power of the sword, thought he had the power to slay enemies of, well, here's the thing, enemies of what? Him, enemies of his power, enemies of his states, enemies of his God. It was for him to decide, he thought. Church or any sort of institution today. For instance, is it wrong to penalize, tax cheats and drug dealers and all sorts of things? No. Is it wrong for Ball State University or the church or the neighborhood association to build a jail and say we're going to find all the drug dealers, all the tax cheats, all the murderers, and we're going to put them in our really local jail? No, they're outside their lane. It would be like if the government came to a synagogue and started demanding that circumcision not be done or something like that. It's outside its lane. It's not even a question of if the matter is right or wrong at that point. It's a question of does that authority have the right to make that determination? This in American history has sometimes been controversial when it comes to parents. Does a parent have the right to withhold medical care from a child? The argument against that, and I would agree, no, a parent does not have that right because that's the parent doesn't have the right to make that sort of basically death decision, if it led to that, over the child. That's not part of the authority the child has. If the child is sick, the parent does not have the right to withhold medical care from that child. But does, for instance, the doctor or the school have the right to tell the parent that the child must, receive this sort of education? That is to say, where the child goes to school. Does the third grade teacher have the authority to tell the parents what time her students must go to bed? No, silly examples. Is there anything wrong with a child being told to go to bed at a certain time? No, it's not a question of right or wrong. It's a question of who has the right to make that moral constraint. When the authority is outside its lane, that is a limit to our submission. And then lastly, I would say and Dr. Lehman would say, there is a constraint when we're protecting ourselves from harm. When protecting ourselves from wrongful harm. That's why the right to self-defense, for instance, is broader than the right of, for instance, a police officer. Yes, the police officer literally formally has authority over you, but if he were trying to harm you, to use the exercise of his authority, your right to self-defense would trump his greater authority over you. You don't have to submit when it would harm you. The fact of the matter is, when we think about submission, because there's no final authority on earth, that is to say, because someone is always under someone else. I could give the example of this. If I were to ask you, who has final authority over children, like we were just talking about? And it's easy to say, the parents. The parents have final authority over the children. Okay. So what if a parent beats his child? Well, you would say, the government would have the right to take that child from that situation, that the government would have the right to, place the child in a safe home. So you say, so I guess the government has the upper authority. Well then, yeah, okay, so now the government says your children must all be Methodist, to pick something off a wall. Okay, I'm pretty sure the government doesn't have that authority. That would be up to the parents. So you see, there's this interplay. There's no ultimate authority in that sense, because it goes back to the realm, to the sphere of someone's authority. So we don't always have clear answers to this. That's when it gets difficult, isn't it? We don't always necessarily have everything laid out for us in a tidy flow chart of different decisions. But that doesn't mean we're without help. Maybe you could make a flow chart, I don't know. But if I were to give you maybe 5 tips for sort of navigating the difficulties of either competing authorities or authorities who seem to be right up on the edge. You're not sure, are they over the boundary? Are they not over the boundary? The first thing to do is to study the authorities. Study the source of the authority's authority. Study the Bible. If it's your pastor, does he really have the right to say this? Study the law. If it's the prosecutor or a police officer. Study the authority's authority. Know what the limits are. 2, I would say, follow your conscience. Follow your conscience. You see, the conscience is something that we have, that has been given to us to help us navigate moral conundra, I guess. But also reform your conscience. Reform your conscience. Sometimes we get into the sort of the trap of thinking that our consciences are maturer than we are. That they come to us perfect and intact and with impeccable moral judgment. And if we just follow them as well as we wish we could, we'd be all right. No, the conscience is more like a muscle. It needs to be toned. It needs to be strengthened. It needs to grow. It needs to be exercised. So you follow your conscience, and to go against your conscience is not wise. But the more mature your conscience is, the more you'll do well in following it. So reform your conscience. And then lastly, I would say 2 things. Seek counsel. If you're facing a situation like this, you ought not be trying to make this decision on your own. Seek counsel. And you can't do anything better than pray. If you're a praying person, I would say that would do you well. So study authority, follow your conscience, but reform your conscience and seek counsel, human or divine. So that may have provoked a few questions or thoughts. I'd be happy to stop for a couple minutes as we think about the submission side. Yes, Leo.
What authority should he be responding to?
Well, I'm not going to answer that question. I'll just say that first, because I think one of the things that we can't do is, besides not knowing all the facts, is I can't put myself into his shoes, in his conscience, and etc. But there are clearly interesting factors in play here. For instance, you have to consider, someone who is in his own culture and sort of organically going about the business of proselytizing versus someone who is coming in illegally. Maybe I'll show some of my cards. I'm not a huge fan of saying you're going to do, telling the government I'm here to do this when you're actually here to do something else. I'm more interested in being honest and seeing how the chips fall. But he was clearly being sensitive to what he saw as his greater authority of God to do that task. And so I think that he would have to weigh those things very carefully. And again, I'm not going to answer for him. I hope that he received good counsel. I hope that he prayed. I hope that he both sought to understand his conscience, but also sought to develop that conscience by these same things. I would obviously love to hear more, especially from the person in question, about.
Well, I think he died.
Well, that
Yeah.
might be a while, but
The movie's on Hulu.
okay.
Just
So, can you respond to my question?
well, I'm not giving the talk, Leo. Yeah, I don't know if he was like I agree with the idea of being upfront with what you're doing.
Well, I got the feeling
But it seemed like he was.
there would be no reason why there would not be a situation that the government would give permission for anybody to make contact with that group.
Right.
So I mean, it wasn't a situation where he is lying about why he's going,
Right.
because he went without the government's permission.
Knowing at all and never lied, but didn't just that's I heard a little bit about it on the news,
Huh.
but I don't know much about
Yeah.
the situation either, so it's hard for me to speak directly to it, other than I think I just say the same thing Elliott did. Is he following his conscience? Is he following the Lord? Is he following the Holy Spirit? How do we know that? Without knowing the details and without being him, it's hard to know what his calling would be, but it sure seems as though somebody needed to reach those people. So, yeah, it's good. It seems a bit
John.
like, and I think you could take some principles from Daniel and Babylon.
Yeah.
I'll give you an easier one.
Oh, why, thank you.
American history, taxation without representation. Our founding fathers lost the tea party.
Mhm.
Put tax on tea, so dumped it in the bay. Well, we started a revolution. And how does that play into authority?
Yeah, that's the short answer is I think I would have done the same thing that the revolutionaries did. I would not say it's a slam dunk case. I'm sure that the loyalists were acting in good conscience, and perhaps they're even blessed for acting in good conscience. But I also think that a good moral case can be made for the revolution. I just read a good book on that topic. The author is Mark David Hall. I don't remember the title. It's like something about equality or truths. I don't know. I'm gonna mess it up. I won't try to say the title.
I'm looking it up.
Okay. But if you look at 250 years of American history, typically Christians have been at the cutting edge of recognizing people's rights in a way that kind of took the rest of the culture a little longer to catch up to.
Yeah, I think you could, if you look at the Civil War,
Mhm.
Lincoln, that's a great study of authority
Mhm.
and taking authority that wasn't legal, but had a higher purpose or a higher calling or, what you were talking about.
Oh, did you figure out that title?
There are a bunch of books
Okay,
Mark,
yeah.
all about the founding fathers, so
Okay.
it's hard to know which
Yeah.
one.
Well, one of them.
Faith in the Founders of the American Republic, The Forgotten Founders on Religion and Public Life, The Founders on God and Government, America and the Just War Tradition,
That sounds promising. It wasn't the one I read, but that could be.
Political and Legal Philosophy of James Wilson, that's a little more specific.
Yeah, and there's another book by Eric Patterson that just came out called The Just War Tradition, I think. No, Eric, I think with a C, Eric Patterson, which is worth checking out. He's been in Washington doing various things. But he's a good guy. Well, let's talk. Sorry.
Oh,
go.
I have a question.
Oh, good.
So I'm gonna, one, it sounds like you're, to what degree are you or Lehman drawing from, Kuiper's for your sovereignty?
I would say almost explicitly. Like it's not actually said, but it's pretty similar. Yeah.
Okay, and then, so when we get to like authority of family
Mm-hmm.
and, well, there are two of them, and there's some examples he gave. One was on the medical, right? So withholding medicine,
Mm-hmm.
there are instances where families have withheld medicine and even to hide the, seen things of them hiding their dead children in their basement because they didn't give the medicine they should have given, right? Where does, it seems blurry though when you get into things like vaccines.
Sure. It
Right,
is
so,
blurry.
so what, any thoughts on that?
On vaccines.
Well, many would say you are putting the children's life at risk, your child's life at risk. That's, it's similar to or the same as abuse.
Well, we're
The government has the right to mandate, and so that child should get, or
Sure.
you aren't providing reproductive care for your child, so the school should be able to do that without you knowing that they're doing that, right? Those sorts of things, or transgender things where the government is, more and more we're getting like schools can start these things, or clinics can
Sure.
start puberty blockers without parents' consent.
Mhm.
What.
Right. I think it's important to note what is and isn't medical care, and that
Good. Okay.
I mean that really gets into
Yep.
these questions.
Yep.
Reproductive care or transition, services, etc. are not. I would argue are not shaped towards the preservation of life, towards the wellness, towards wholeness, etc., etc. They
So
are.
they're outside their lane. That's-
They are using medical knowledge to damage and to mar and to destroy and to kill.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's where I have to go with that. For vaccines, I see a difference between someone who is actually sick and someone who has a chance of maybe getting sick in the future. So I don't know if like a public school, wants to get down to which, does it have a right to demand this or that vaccine? Again, I think that really the parents should decide. I mean, they're free to not send that child to the school if they want to object to that. But there is definitely a difference between, say a Christian scientist whose child, clearly has scarlet fever and refuses
Right.
any treatment, versus someone who is healthy and, may or may not get whatever the vaccine would keep. And there's a lot more that could be said there.
Those are helpful distinctions. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Sure,
And then can I ask one more?
definitely.
Authority over children, you said is if I heard you right, you're kind of going back like, what if the child was this, then it's the family, but then the government might step
Right,
in and
yeah.
it's back to the family. Would it be helpful to think of it rather than authority over children as more like the types of things that a family has authority over and the types of things that
Yeah.
the government has authority over, and so the child himself may fall into either one of those spheres
Right.
depending on the category.
Yeah, and that's obviously not limited to a child.
Right.
And I right now have 2 jobs, so I don't have. They're not like splitting me in half. But for when I'm doing these things or at these times, I have that authority. When I'm doing those things at those times, I have a different authority.
Yeah.
And thankfully, they haven't gotten in conflict yet. We'll just hope it stays that way. Well, I wanted to spend our last few minutes thinking about some helpful, I hope, principles for exercising authority. Looks like we have maybe 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. So we're going to give you 6-ish. Yeah, 6. 6 principles for exercising authority. These, from this point, should sound familiar, or maybe even review. First, authority is not unaccountable, but submits to a higher authority. The author actually gives the example of an orchestra. In the orchestra, almost every player is under authority, and almost every player has authority. So at the end, there's literally authority over who turns the page. So if you're on one higher chair, if you're the third chair viola, you would turn the page. I mean, you wouldn't turn the page. The fourth chair viola would. So everyone is authority to the person higher, but all the violists are accountable to the section chair, to the head violist. But the violist, while having authority over those players, is an authority to the concertmaster, who is the lead violinist. So the violinist has authority over those various section leaders, but she is under authority to the conductor. Everyone is accountable to someone else, while also often having authority over someone else. It's sort of the difference, if you want to think about it in political terms, on one far extreme, you have total democracy. So everything goes to a plebiscite. You want to know, what this new rule is? Get everyone in the town hall and let's have a vote. Total democracy versus dictatorship, who's accountable to no one. Ideally, we're somewhere in the middle. So we have people who exercise authority. We have people who make decisions. We have people who get things done, but they're not unaccountable. They're accountable to the voters. They're accountable to the law. Hopefully they're accountable morally to their maker. So first principle is that authority is not unaccountable, but must submit to other and higher authorities. Second thing I would say is that good authority is ordered toward human flourishing. It's ordered toward the good of those whom it has been given to lead. Why do you have authority as a parent? It's not ultimately so that your child goes to bed at a certain time and you can watch TV. I mean that might be nice, but that's not. We know that's why you don't have the authority. It's so the child becomes an adult with wisdom and maturity and education and hopefully some manners, etc., etc. It's ordered for a purpose. And if you're not reaching that purpose, you're misusing your authority. Why does someone in a corporation have authority? And why does someone in the corporate world have authority? Well, it's for human flourishing. It's so that goods and services can flow to the market, so that the investors' returns can have returns and then can reinvest and produce further goods and services that flow to the market. The authority is for a purpose. It is not merely to serve itself. Why does someone in a nonprofit have authority? For human flourishing, for the life, for the health of others. We talked a little bit about politicians, civil rulers. Why do they have authority? Well, as we saw, it's actually for the freedom, for the health and the wealth of their citizens. I think this is one reason why good people of authority, good rulers, good leaders, people who exercise authority well and helpfully are always looking to raise up the next generation, always looking to raise up other future leaders, other leaders, for the good of all, not for the sake of authority itself, kind of keeping it to myself, seeking to hog all the authority and eventually perhaps becoming a despot. No, good authority is always looking to share its authority, looking to raise up new leaders. Related to this, perhaps our next principle, it is not unteachable, but seeks wisdom. It is not unteachable, but seeks wisdom. In the book, the author gives the contrast between the Pharaoh of Joseph's day in the book of Genesis in the Bible, the Pharaoh of Moses' day in the book of Exodus. Think of which one of those leaders was unteachable or teachable. Which of those leaders sought wisdom, refused wisdom? In the day of Joseph, you had a man who had a couple of weird dreams. So he talks to his wine steward, who says, "Hey, I know someone in prison." And even today, you can imagine the ruler saying, "Great, okay, I'm not going to go, listen to someone in prison, let alone bring him up to me and tell him, my deepest, darkest dreams." But that's exactly what the Pharaoh does. He brings Joseph out of prison. Joseph gives an interpretation of the dream that he could have been blowing hot air. I mean, he could have been just totally making it up. He could have been a fabulist. But Pharaoh trusted him. He thought, for the good of my country, for the survival of my people, for the continuance of this nation, I'm going to put this ex-con foreigner right up next to me as the second highest person in the land. And I'm going to allow him to, take charge of only the most important thing of everyone's daily life, the bread on the table. I'm going to put him in charge of life and death, of feasting or famining. That's not a word. Feast or famine. Because he was not unteachable, but he sought the wisdom of others and was willing to share. You can compare that to the Pharaoh of Moses' day, who when it was brought to his attention that his requirements on his slaves was a little unrealistic, he made it worse. He said, "All right, now you got to gather your own straw and make bricks and make more of them." When Pharaoh said, "Hey, can we just go out to the desert and have a little break? Can we have a worship retreat?" He's like, "No, I'm gonna make things worse and worse." He was not teachable. He did not seek wisdom. A good leader has to always keep in mind that this interplay between short-term risk, long-term health. Short-term risk, long-term health. And this is still this third point. Think of Joseph's Pharaoh. The short-term risk. Am I fomenting some rebellion by letting this guy come into my palace and become my prime minister and have all this authority? Play that against the long-term health, the long-term needs, the long-term good that could come out of that. He had to exercise his authority quite judiciously to save his country, to ascertain what was best, not merely for his own head, but for all those under him. A good leader in this position will seek to give encouragement and not simply, flattery. But he also has to receive encouragement and praise without, giving in to pride, succumbing to pride. Likewise, a good exercise of authority will be able to give criticism without foolishly or needlessly harming or angering a person. It's part of a person in a position of authority to criticize, to point out where people have failed, to show where people could do better. But in a way that doesn't needlessly antagonize, doesn't exasperate one's children, that doesn't anger or hurt. And when the shoe's on the other foot, to receive criticism. Often the people with the most authority are the worst at taking criticism because they feel like it's their little fiefdom that they have to protect. And so they hear any criticism as, catapult coming against the castle wall. And they are afraid if they listen to it, if they entertain it, if they receive it, that they're somehow putting their authority in jeopardy. But a good leader receives criticism without becoming discouraged or angry. Sometimes discouragement is a temptation too when we receive criticism in the position. So, exercising authority well, not unaccountable, but submits to higher authority, ordered toward human flourishing, not unteachable, but seeks wisdom. Next, exercise authority well. It is neither permissive nor authoritarian, but does administer discipline. I think we touched on this briefly earlier, but it is neither lax, permissive, but neither is it authoritarian, despotic. To be clear, the threat of discipline, we'll need to define discipline in a second, but the threat of discipline gives authority its teeth. And perhaps we could say it separates sort of the informal authority that Roger was talking about with the formal authority that someone has when it's been vested to him. Because the threat of discipline gives authority its teeth. Discipline, even in that sense, can be soft or hard. It can be the discipline of discipleship, the discipline of exhortation, the discipline of rebuke or censure, the discipline of penalty. In the case of federal government, state government, a corporation that penalizes an employee for some sort of wrongdoing, etc., etc. But think about what happens when either extreme is entertained. A few years ago, there was a school in Oakland that closed for 2 weeks because the teachers lost control of the students. They literally could not keep the students in their desks quiet, keep them in the classroom. They couldn't do their job because, and it was clear from the evidence, because of permissiveness, because they would not take a stand for discipline, because they would not, for the good of the students, impose any sort of censure, any sort of discipline, whether it be detention or just a strong word, sit down, stop talking, listen to the lesson. The extreme of total permissiveness had sapped the teacher's authority to the point that it was meaningless. Think of a bureaucracy or a large corporation. That bad employee to whom it's easier to shuffle to another department. Now it takes so long to file any sort of discipline, and then the unions are going to file a grievance, and then you're going to have a hearing. After that, it'll probably be dismissed anyway. It's easier just to reassign the person to somebody else. Make him, her problem in accounting, and get her out of finance or whatever. Just keep shuffling the person around and around from one place to the next. It's bad for the employee. I mean, this isn't good. This isn't nice. This isn't helpful. It's bad for everyone. Because, well, you know why it's bad for everyone. Because you have an employee not doing the job paid to do, causing a headache, causing administrative concern, etc., etc. And I think we can imagine the other extreme of the Cain mutiny sort of authoritarianism, of being all over everybody's backs all the time, of not allowing anyone to breathe. Of course, if you read or watch the Cain mutiny, that went back to fear. It went back to a sense of inadequacy, an inability to exercise authority well. Keep in mind, in a position of authority over others, predictable outcomes are a kindness. if you're the consistent leader who isn't just totally lax or isn't tyrannical, predictable outcomes are a kindness. People know what to expect. People know that if they do this, they'll be rewarded and they'll be encouraged and they'll have greater and more responsibility. People know if they do that, they'll be perhaps given a little more attention of the negative sort in many different ways. But they know that ahead of time. And they can shape their behavior accordingly. Predictable outcomes are a kindness, avoiding those extremes. So that's the fourth principle. We have two more here. Importantly, I think, very importantly, good authority does not shift the costs. It is not self-protective when things go wrong, but bears the costs in as much as it is possible. You know what Truman said, the buck stops here. There's always someone else who could be blamed. There's always a way to, shovel the you-know-what out the door onto somebody else. Successes have 1,000 fathers, but failures are orphans, as the saying goes. No one wants to take authority, take responsibility when things go wrong. But really, it should be the other way around. If you think of the flow chart, praise and benefit should flow downward. Encouragement and praise and the positive sort of exhortations should flow downward to those underneath you. That they receive encouragement and praise and whatever boon you can give them when things go well. And ideally, then, blame flows up. Blame flows up to those who had the authority to implement the decision, to make the decision, to bring things to bear, who had all the answers and still maybe came to the wrong solution. Ideally, blame is not sort of a portion to everyone below you who you think are expendable. Even in the household, it's often easy to just sort of convince yourself that it's the children's fault when anything goes wrong. Maybe sometimes it is, but if you stop and think, how would the blame flow upward here? What did I do perhaps to exacerbate the situation? What did I do that the child didn't have predictable outcomes, didn't know what to expect? Was I hot or cold that day? This will require discernment. You can't always absorb other people's mistakes, otherwise they'll never learn. It does require discernment. But it would be interesting to consider the first instinct of someone in a situation like that. Okay, who can I blame for this? Or looking inward, what have I done wrong? No, or who can I praise for this? Or how can I make sure my boss gives me a raise? Praise flows to others whenever possible. Blame you soak up wherever possible. Lastly, our last principle, and this even goes back to a little bit what Roger was asking, is understanding the difference between authority of control and authority of counsel. Authority of control or authority of counsel. Some in authority have the right to enforce what's commanded, to discipline when not obeyed. Others do not. Others only have the authority of counsel. For instance, I mentioned earlier, if you believe that a husband has some sort of authority over his wife, I hope in that situation you would at least admit that you only have authority of counsel. You don't have any disciplinary or controlling authority over that person. I would put doctors into that. We're talking about medical things. At the end of the day, the doctor has great authority, but it's only of counsel. If you don't want to have chemotherapy, the doctor can't make you undergo chemotherapy. isn't the case with children, as we talked about, when you're talking about yourself, and even then it's not the doctor who has the authority to make that child be, receive treatment, it's the state. But never would a doctor have the authority of control. On the other hand, a cop would. If a cop sees someone, burglaring a business, he has the authority to command that person to stop. He has the physical authority when a crime is in progress to enter the premises and to stop it. A parent has the authority. He doesn't have to just suggest that the child do this or that. The parent can say, if you do this or that, I'm taking the car keys away from you, or I'm sending you to bed early. The parent has the authority of command over the child, but always for the good of the child, not for the parent's peace of mind or ease, but for the good of the child. So, when we're exercising authority, we're not unaccountable, but we submit to other authorities. We're ordered toward human flourishing. We're not unteachable, but we seek wisdom. We're neither permissive nor authoritarian, but administer discipline wisely, sagely. Not self-protective, but bearing of the costs. Not unaware of the difference between authority of counsel and authority of command. Do those principles, as we wrap up, do those principles raise any questions for anyone that you'd like to raise to me?
It's not a question, but I just, as you talk, I thought about in modern life, the best example immediately stuck in my mind and came back again and again is in sports. Mm-hmm. Coaches, you basically have a meritocracy, and the authority follows a lot of the principles, maybe not even intentionally, but they just like those 6 points, they apply whether people realize it or want them to or not.
And it's not uniform across sports. A football coach's authority is very different from a baseball manager's authority. A football authority is designing plays. It is seeking to see exactly what will take place on that field for the next 4 downs.
Yeah.
Baseball managers are much more hands-off. They're more setting a culture and allowing people to succeed over the long course of 162 games. Very different from on this play, everyone is going to be doing exactly that, and hopefully we'll get a first down and march down the field. But they're both important kinds of authority.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Today's kind of a special day. It's December the 7th, Pearl Harbor Day.
Yeah.
And every year I usually watch Tour. And there's a scene in the movie where the admiral's in his office and he's looking out on the bay and all the ships are burning, and he has these officers there and they're reporting on the damages that's been done. And a bullet comes through the window. It's deflected. It lands on his desk. He picks it up in his hand. He says it would have been more merciful if it would have hit me, because he knows that as an admiral, he's going to be responsible for all this, and it's right there in front of him.
Yeah.
Mm.
That's right.
Mm.
That's good. Well, thank you for coming. And like I said, I do have a few extra copies of this book if anyone wants some Christmas reading or gifts, I guess. And, I'll be around if you have any more questions afterward. Thank you.
Thank you.